The threat of a recession is becoming more and more real every single day. And today we're going to talk about how investors and tenants can prepare to weather this storm.
Yeah, when you're investing, you have to consider the tenant. Right now, the tenants are in trouble. If we head into a recession, they're already getting slammed with high inflation and rent increases and things like food and gas and all those kinds of things are clipping away at them. And so as a landlord, you got to be really cognizant. There's a bunch of moves that you can make to make sure that you have stable cash flow during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the first thing you need to understand is that a lot of people are going to be losing their jobs and hours are going to be cut. If they're self-employed, contracts might be cut. And you as a landlord have to be understanding of that to a degree.
This has happened before. And a lot of during times where you have a lot of rent increases and there's less option for the tenant, you basically can get away with anything. Right. But now it's moving the other way. It's now basically heading to a renter's market for at least the next 18 months. And so you have to manage differently and you have to be a little different in a landlord. And the one thing is you have to consider the tenant. You have to probably do less rent increases. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to stay there longer, because every single time you have turnover, it's expensive. You have advertising costs, you have maintenance costs, you have vacancy, all those kinds of things severely impact your cash flow.
But there are strategies for this, right? It's not that you as a landlord have to just not take rent and, not get paid. But I know MC companies, something like this happened in 2008, and your company set tenants up on weekly payment plans.
Yeah, we did. And here's the thing. This is all about communication. If you have a good relationship with your tenant, like even this week, you've been on and off with your tenants all week, right?
Tenant issues this week.
Yeah, but it's okay. Like, at least they're contacting you and you're dealing with them, and hopefully you're at some point with them where you can sit down with them and say, listen, where are you? What's going on with your job? Danielle's got one tenant that's actually a commissioned salesperson.
Right.
And they're a little bit in trouble.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so you sit down and you say, what can we do? And I think she's got a couple kids, and it's a situation that she's in, and the last thing that you want is to turn over a unit. You want to work with her,
right? Or her just not pay me in general, right? And I've dealt with this with tenants before. I've had tenants lose jobs, and I'm very communicative. Like, if a tenant that always pays on time is now paying me 3 days late, or they're telling me, hey, I can't get your rent till the 8th, I don't just say, okay, I say, hey, what's going on? What's happening? Well, my boyfriend lost his job, so we're down to one income. And then I work with them, right? Well, why don't you guys, pay me, X amount a week? Is that easier to make up for this rent? Because he just started a new job. There was a 2-week lapse. You hear these things all the time. And going into this, you guys are going to hear this stuff more. And sometimes it also just makes sense to let them out of the lease. I've had to do that a couple times.
Yeah.
And you don't always have to charge, I have tenants where, they break the lease because they want to move early, and that's one case scenario. But another case scenario, I might say, listen, if you give me a 30-day notice or a 60-day notice, why don't we get you out of the lease? Because I want someone that comes in that can pay.
Yeah, you actually did that. There was somebody that came to you mid-lease.
Yeah,
and
she lost her job.
Yep, and you guys were communicating, and you found a tenant.
Yeah.
While she was there. Right?
Yep.
And then there was maybe just a couple of days of vacancy loss there.
Exactly. And she let me do all the turnover while she was in the unit.
And show it.
And show it, because you're working together. And, a lot of you may look and say, well, why wouldn't you charge her? She broke the lease. You have in your lease, it's a 1 month, fee.
Right. Yep.
And it's like, yeah, but she's going through a hard time. And why would I make that harder when she also is going to work with me so I can get that space filled with someone that can pay? Because the last thing I want in my unit is a tenant that's struggling to pay me. A, it's stressful for them, but B, it's stressful for me.
And let's look at what the lease break fee is for. It's for if you're not communicating with your tenant, it gives you a month cushion. That's what it's for.
Right.
So in this particular case, the tenant reached out to you. You guys had a good relationship already. She told you the truth. You said, okay, let's figure this out. And why charge them that if you only had a few days of vacancy?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing is to give your tenant some ideas, right? Like if they're struggling to pay rent, you can tell them if they have a 2 bedroom or, even a 1 bedroom, if they're okay sharing a room, like, hey, if you can sublet, if you can get a roommate, as long as they go through my background and credit check requirements, like I'm totally okay with that. And I think, landlords have become very rigid in the last few years because they've been spoiled, right? Because they can say, listen, I can just get somebody else in. I don't want to deal with this, right? So they are spoiled and they're not
Most
receptive
landlords suck.
to their tenants.
Yeah, property managers. If you're a new landlord and you're you better take a look at where you're heading. I mean, maybe you have a really good tenant, maybe, but this is the best time for property managers, right? They're going to soar here because it's going to expose a lot of stuff.
Well, it's so interesting because I'm on some landlord groups on Facebook, right? Because I like being on those. I get some good information. But, I see people all the time, like, I won't even show a unit until somebody has done a credit and background check. I'm not even going to show them a place. And it's like, okay, well, I don't necessarily want to do a credit and background check if I haven't even seen your place. I don't want my credit run if I don't even know if I want your place.
Right.
But they're so much on their high horse and they're so used to tenants having no options that they want to do that. And it's like, no, I make it very clear what my credit requirements are. So that way I'm not wasting their time or my time or their time. But I'm not going to sit up there and be like, well, you have to apply before you even see the place. I mean, I think that's ridiculous.
Right. And here's the thing. If you just tell a tenant that you're going to run a criminal credit background check, typically, if they know you're going to do that, they typically are communicating with you at that point.
Yeah, they don't want to waste their time either. Of course, I've had a couple people where I show up and they're like, hey, listen, but for the most part, they're not going to waste their time doing that.
Right. So it's that's the wrong message just said. To the tenants.
And tenants just know, like, you have a little bit more power now because there is more supply. So you don't need to be doing that either.
That's a good point. Like if you haven't looked around, you should, because what you want is people that are working with you and you have better options now.
Yeah, absolutely. If a landlord's doing that to you at the beginning, it's not really a good precedent on how they're going to be as a landlord. So the second thing that tenants and investors need to keep in mind is your tenants may move out because they're deal shopping. So now might not be the time to raise the rent on them because they are looking around, and chances are pretty good if you were at market rent before, you're a little above market rent now.
Yeah, and this is why you always need to know. Like, here's what you should be doing. If you have a tenant, let's say you have a 12-month lease, you should be looking at like 9 months, 8 months out. And you should be looking at what the market is doing at that point.
Mm-hmm.
You should be seeing if there's vacancies. You should be checking out what the rents are. Because in your case, you have 60-day notices, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to want to be armed with all this stuff in month 8 and 9 and 10, because month 10, you could get a notice from your tenant.
Right.
And if you're not reaching out to them prior to that, you need to reach out to them in month 9 and say, listen, the market has gone up and these rents are low, but we're going to keep you the same. That would be a good strategy. Or the market has gone down. You might just want to say, we're going to keep you the same. But if the tenant decides to leave, then of course you're going to have a vacancy.
Well, and you bring up a good point. The tenant is not going to wait until the 60-day notice to figure out what they're going to do, because they have to give you a 60-day notice. And so you need to give them some time to do some research, and you don't want them looking around. So if you let them know 90 days, typically tenants are going to look more than 90 days out. So if you let them know 90 days out, hey, your rent's not changing, then it's like a weight off their shoulders. They don't have to look. They don't have to worry about moving. They don't have to worry about price shopping. It's just very much a relief for them. And in this market, don't get greedy and want to up your rent $25 or $50 because it's really not worth it to lose a tenant in this market.
And one other thing to consider is that the tenants have a cost to move, right? Mm-hmm. So like my youngest son just moved. Okay. So now obviously he's got a bunch of buddies and they have trucks and all that kind of stuff. But in this particular case, he had some furniture and stuff, and they're back and forth. But then there's the hookups of all the utilities. And most people, if you don't have all that, you're going to have a little U-Haul, and you're going to have, people to help you, or you're going to maybe even use a moving service. And then, of course, moving somewhere else, you got extra deposits, and you've got to, to hook into the, the cable and the power and all those kinds of things. So there are costs, right? It's fun though to move into a new place, but there are costs that the tenant has, and so don't forget as a landlord to consider that, because they're also looking at a cost to move and an inconvenience, right?
Yep.
Depending on, so it's not just one way. So when you're looking at maybe rents have gone down or they're trending down, if I were in your shoes, I would just say, hey, 9 months into a 12-month lease, we would send something and say, we want to renew you at the current rate. And then you start a dialogue with them, right?
Yep.
That's essentially what you're trying to do. You're just trying to hedge the down, and also give them the benefit. If rents are up, you should know that. You should say rents in the area are higher, and we're gonna keep you at the same rate. What you're trying to do is create stability of cash flow through the next 12 months. Danille did that when she bought this place. She actually did a little differently, but she found somebody to do an 18-month lease with a flat fee, and then they're doing an Airbnb arbitrage,
Yep.
I think. And so she has a guaranteed number every month, guaranteed cash flow every month, 0 vacancy, 0 maintenance, 0 turnover, 0 marketing. And her only exposure is if that Airbnb arbitrage doesn't work and they end up giving her notice. So this is all about cash flow in the long term. And most landlords didn't have to worry about the having vacancy for very long, but turnover costs are expensive. I mean, even in the Airbnbs, we're hearing $200, $300, even $400 just for cleaning.
Right.
So, guys, especially if you have a tenant in there a long time, and they have pets or whatever, it's going to be expensive. Turnover paint's expensive, maintenance is expensive. So, and vacancy is expensive. So if you have something, let's say that's $3,000 a month, which is probably high, but let's just say that's $100 a day in vacancy.
Right.
Period. So if it's vacant a week, that's $700. If it's vacant 2 weeks, it's obviously $1,400. So you start to see how these things can add up. A lot of people don't consider vacancy.
Yeah. And I mean, to get that additional $25 or $50 that might make your tenant look around, a week of vacancy is going to just eat that all up.
It can just be an annoyance. Trust me. If you're going to if you have a $3,000 rent and you tell a tenant you're going to raise them $25, they're just going to be annoyed with you.
Yeah.
It's not even worth that.
Exactly. And you touched on something, another good point is you want to look right now as a landlord and as a tenant at longer leases. So I had a girlfriend, she just rented out her place. It's her first place she's renting out. And she goes, they want to do 18 months. Of course, I'm not going to do that. And I said, no, you should do 18 months. In times of a recession and in times of there's no rent growth, it is in your benefit to do a longer lease.
If you have a great customer that's paying you timely, do a longer leases right now. I mean, you guys need to take a look at, obviously, if you're negative cash flow and you bought incorrectly and you've got your rate on your loan is going up and your mortgage payment has gone up and all that kind of stuff, you have a different scenario. But in this particular case, if you have a customer right now that you like and they're paying on time and they're very low maintenance, there'll always be time, trust me. And if they're a long-term hold for you, you're going to be fine. But you're right. This is the time to do longer leases. In the times of when there's little supply, you want to do shorter leases. And when there's a lot of supply, you want to do longer leases. So if your market is going to suffer from, let's say, a lot of new product and a lot of vacancy, then that is the time to do longer leases.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't be afraid of those. And the next thing we want to touch on is understand that more people are going to be living in your unit potentially.
Yeah.
So if you have a 2-bedroom, before it would always be one person sometimes, maybe 2 people. Now look at it like it's going to be like a couple and their mom or a couple and their brother or 3 friends that want to live together or 4 friends that want to live together. I mean, you don't want to house pack it, but it's realistic that you could throw in an additional person or 2 to make the rent work.
Well, you just had that. You had a young man in his 20s come, and his mom and him actually rented a place together.
Well, it was his mom, his fiance, and him.
Yeah, and his mom wanted it because she liked coming to Scottsdale every once in a while.
Yep.
She doesn't live in Scottsdale, and it was a win-win. And so you're right.
Yeah, and then my other unit had a couple with their brother. You know, they were younger. She was in med school. But these situations wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. You know, they would have just got their own place. But now that everything's so expensive, people need additional people to qualify.
And what you guys need to consider here is that both need to have their credit run.
Yeah.
So you always want to have the credit run on both occupants.
Yeah, all occupants.
Make sure you know who's there.
Yep.
Yeah. What should be on the lease are the cars, the license plate numbers. You need to have the information of all occupants and, of course, pets. You know, they always slide pets in.
Right. Absolutely. Well, so this next one, I think is really important. And I think that a lot of times investors make this big mistake. And that's renting out vacancies too quickly. So you get desperate. You want someone in the unit and you just say, it's fine, I'm moving them in.
Yeah, don't do that.
Right.
This is you're better off. Obviously, this makes so much sense, and we've been guilty of it. I have obviously we have 300 employees. We have had, there's a lot of pressure from the corporate office to fill vacancies, right? And there's a lot of pressure. You probably have a lot of financial pressure to fill vacancies, but I will tell you, be careful here. You want to make sure that you do the process, run the criminal credit background checks. We do a sex offender checks too. Make sure that's all done. Make sure it's vetted. Make sure you check all that stuff out. Make sure they're working where they say. Make sure they have the funds and all those key things. It's really no different than if they're buying something. They're essentially, if their rent's $1,000 a month, it's a $12,000 contract. Like that's the way you have to think about it. It's a 12-month contract if you're doing a 12-month lease. So that's a big commitment for anybody, $12,000. So you make sure that they could pay. You'd be so surprised that when I'm not saying that you can't rent something quickly, because you can, but take your time, do the right things, don't rush the process. And if they come today and they want to move in tonight or tomorrow, you should have some red flags. Normal people don't do that.
Right. Normal people have to give notice unless they're in a situation where they're having to quickly leave, which, could be a problem for you. And I think people too, they hear people's stories and they just make it seem okay in their head. But the truth is, you're better off with a vacant unit than having to evict someone or deal with not getting paid or deal with any of those kind of problems.
Because you're actually in a much worse situation, because now you have somebody in a unit that's not paying. So you're better off having a vacant, clean unit ready to rent than somebody in a unit that you're fighting with, that you're trying to collect with, that you actually are incurring legal fees with. Who knows about the damage of what's going on in the unit, and maybe the disruption with other tenants. That's another thing to consider. So there's just really, really, really be careful. The key to this business is the tenant, finding tenants with good credit, and most tenants are amazingly good.
Yeah, absolutely. They're great, but you just have to be careful. And the people that I see that run into trouble are typically small landlords that skip some of this stuff because they're desperate. They want to fill it, or they even fill it for under market. I mean, we're staying in an Airbnb right now that's about half the price it should be because the investors bought it and wanted to put somebody in right away, and we got a smoking deal.
Now, by the way, I mean, it's like 12,000 low, like for the month, like, right. This place should be 25,000 easy a month. And, we're half that. And so, that was somebody that didn't do their homework.
Well, I think they just got nervous. They bought the place because they had just bought it and they wanted to fill it. And this is the most popular month here. And they just stuck us in. And while we appreciate it, it wasn't the best investment decision. So that's something else you don't want to do. You don't want to just hurry up and get somebody in and not get a good rental rate either, because that's not really helping you either, because, they're going to be there a year. And if you jack them a bunch at the end of the year, they're not going to stay.
Right, right. And it's a brand new place. It's, they paid a lot in the millions for this place. And, they rushed.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
They rushed.
So, do your research, know your market, know your rents. And, before you jump into the pool, you better know what's happening.
Yep. And then I think that another point is, a lot of landlords are refusing to negotiate. And I think that that is a mistake. Now, I don't necessarily mean negotiate on the rent, but, typically some people get security deposit and first and last month's rent. In a recession, people are going to be tight. They may not have, $6,000 to just hand you. So, if you're comfortable with it, you can take off the last month's rent. You can do installments on the security deposit. I know for me, when they decide to lease, they owe me the security deposit, which is a non-refundable deposit that turns into a security deposit to hold the place. But I don't need their first month's rent until, right before they move in. So that usually gives them a month to come up with that. I don't need it all right away because people aren't going to have it.
Right. And the key here is also, if you're going to make a deal, you have to make the same deal with everyone.
Right.
So that's the big thing. You want to make sure that if you're deciding on doing something to work with somebody, you can't kind of work with one person and not another one. You just need to make sure that whatever deal you're proposing is the same deal for all. That's the big thing there. So, this should be pretty black and white. Typically, if you find people that have poor credit, the one exception we make is sometimes that's medical, or sometimes it's perhaps like a divorce. Okay, but if they have really high revolving balances and they have history, obviously, of lots of apartments or houses and rentals and they're short term, probably a lot more red flags. So, so there are things that you can see inside of the applications. And if you guys are confused about this stuff, you need to go online and get into some of these landlord groups and get into some of these other things. You can learn a lot. Also, make sure that you guys are using the proper forms, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't just pull a form from online and assume that that's going to be fine.
We've seen this problem. There are lots of leases. The lease needs to be, our lease, is, I don't know what it is, maybe 8 or 10 pages now.
Yeah.
Every year there's something new that we learn and we add. And that's a really, really important thing, because what you want to be able to do is, if you come to the situation, you want to be able to pull the lease out and enforce it, or have a conversation with the tenant over it. At the end of the day, everything falls back to the lease. You have your landlord-tenant laws, obviously, for each state. They're different, but not that different. I mean, the discrimination stuff is the same, and that's federal. But there are certain things that you can do and not do with security deposits and those kinds of things. But things like pets, extra people, wear and tear, all that kind of stuff needs to be in your lease, because that's what you're going to have to fall back on. So if you're making a deal with your deposits, let's say, you need to be able to make that deal with everybody. So you can do it around a credit score. So let's say maybe they have a 600 credit score because of medical, let's say. Then that's when you say, again, it doesn't matter who. It doesn't matter if it's somebody that's older or younger, or it doesn't really matter. It just has to be the same all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to the forms, that's really important. My girlfriend that I was mentioned before that just is getting a tenant, I said, hey, do you have a lease? Do you need a lease? And she, oh, no, I have one. And she sends me over this one sheet that looks like something that you would fill out. It looks like
off the internet,
a rental application. And I said, well, this isn't really very thorough. Let me send you mine. And she's like, oh my God, do I really need to have him fill all this out? And I said, yeah, because if you have an issue, it always reverts back to the lease. Any issue that you have with your tenant reverts back to the lease. And she was asking me too, well, what do I do if they don't pay? Because she's nervous. She's a new landlord. I said, it all reverts back to the lease. So in the lease, if it's not in there, then you don't do anything. You know what I mean? So you have to all be in the lease. So just make sure, if there's something that you guys should invest in as, new landlords, it's a good lease.
Right.
If you have to pay $500 for it, if you pay $1,000 for it, it's worth it.
So what you're doing, if you cut a deal, it needs to be in the lease.
Yeah.
So, and then if there's if you're negotiating, you're negotiating the original terms of the lease. So you're either negotiating what you're going to put on the lease for a new tenant, or you're negotiating with an existing tenant and you're changing the lease. But either way, everything goes into the lease.
Yeah, and tenants will, question your lease. Like I had a tenant and he got a HOA fine, and he said, well, I don't have to, he was mad. The fine was kind of ridiculous in my opinion. I didn't say that to him, but he goes, well, I don't have to pay this. It's like your place. And I said, no, if you look in the lease, you initialed right here. And he said, okay. And he paid it. But the truth is, if I wouldn't have had that in there, he's right. I would have had to pay it.
That's actually a big one. So those of you need to go check that, because that's, your tenants, especially if it's in an HOA, which most of them are, they see these days. And the homeowner associations offer any kind of fine for whatever, then that needs to pass on to the tenant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's something that a lot of people miss.
But people just don't expect their, landlords sometimes think they can just tell their tenant, like, this is how it is. And it's just not true. It just has to be in the lease.
Yep. If the tenant sees it's not in the lease, then it's going to be on you.
Yep. So let's talk about Limitless. We have Limitless coming up at the end of August.
So good. Yep. Yeah. It's obviously we're almost sold out. We have 50 speakers, 3 stages. We got some incredible people coming. These are real people doing real deals, and not the big flash. These are not high-paid professional speakers. These are real people doing like self-storage deals and wellness deals, and obviously multifamily and office buildings, and obviously we have Eric Sue. I can't wait to have Eric come, because he's a media company, and he's going to do a whole thing about AI and how you can build your business through AI. We have a podcast stage, and it's just going to be amazing.
It's going to be a great event. So make sure you use Ken10 to get 10% off, and we hope to see you guys there.
Yeah, by the way, it's the 29th, 30th, and 31st of August at the Gaylord Palms, and we'll be there. Can't wait to see you guys.
Okay, so let's hop into our Ken Pro questions. If you guys want to sign up, you just go to kenmcelroy.com/join-now. So Sydney has a good question. So she said, I'm moving in with my fiance, so I'm looking to sell my house or maybe rent it out. I can cash flow $900 a month on it, or I can sell it and profit $150,000. It's my primary, so I wouldn't owe any taxes. My parents think I should sell it because it's an old home, but I think you guys would say I should rent it out. What should I do in Ohio for reference?
So here's how I look at things. That's a really good question. If you had the $150,000 and you put it into a T-bill, let's say, right? That would make you, at 5%, that would make you $7,500 a year. Because, again, this is all about what are you going to do with the money, period. It's going to go into a savings account or whatever it is. So $900 a month, from my standpoint, is, what is that, about $11,000? Mm-hmm. So I look at it that way. I look at this is $11,000 against $150,000. So, what is that? That's about 8 or 9% cash on cash, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how I look at it. I look at not necessarily the 900. I look at the 150. What am I going to do with the 150? Now, if the 150 is going to move into something else that you're going to buy that's going to cash flow, that's a different scenario. But if you're just putting the 150 into some kind of a bank account and it's making 3-4%, let's say, then that's what it's going to make. So I'm always looking at what am I going to make on my money. Don't forget, the 150 will always be there. Right. That's the one thing to think about. It will always be there. It's not going to go away and evaporate. So it's like a slush fund for you, But if you sell it and then you have the cash sitting there, the issue is what are you going to do with that? So from my standpoint, in that scenario, with the $900 a month, I would do the $900 a month, and I would cash flow, and then I would have my tenant pay that down even more. Because don't forget, the 150 is going to grow. If the tenant's paying down their mortgage, it'll go to 160, then 170, just because the tenant's paying down the mortgage. So that's the other piece.
Absolutely, because you're going to be charging them, let's just say $2,000 a month on rent, And so that $2,000, I mean, you're really making $2,000 a month on it, even though you're only cash flowing 900, because they're paying down your mortgage as well.
Right. And the other thing is that 900 could be tax free. So obviously I'm not a tax professional, but what I mean is that you've got depreciation. You may or may not have enough, so it might not be all tax free, but there's a piece of that that's for sure tax free. So you got to consider that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also, we talk about this on the channel, but, we're in a time of high inflation. We believe we're going to stay in a time of high inflation, and asset prices do go up over time. That doesn't mean they can't soften for a bit, but if you hold this thing, it's going to go up, and I believe you're going to kick yourself in 20 years when you look back and you're like, I sold my house for $200,000. Now it's worth, $500,000 if I would have just held it, plus all the rent you got every single month.
The way to look at it is, obviously, it's a good point. What's your hold period? If it's 10 years, then go back 10 years and say, what was this house worth then?
Right.
Right. And, or go back 20 years and you'll take a look. I was just with my mom. And my mom still has the house that I grew up in, and she paid $10,000 for that house. $10,000.
Crazy.
I mean,
now your mom's 90. We have to.
No, I know, but I'm like, and at the end of her life, she was a hairdresser and had a great little business, but didn't have a lot of wealth. Mm-hmm. And it's all sitting in her house. And thankfully, it's all sitting in her house. So we rented it. And it pays for her assisted care. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the 100% of it. So the tenant, because she obviously paid it off. But the tenant actually pays for her lifestyle.
Right. And Ken takes care of his mom, everyone. Yeah. So let's not get the thing, but we're just saying. Of
course I do.
The math does work for that, even if she didn't have Ken.
And the point is the inflation that we're about ready to see is going to grow the asset price.
Yep, absolutely.
For sure.
But just remember, real estate's not like this. It kind of goes up and down, but over time, it continues to go up.
Right. If the Fed, if the Fed is able to achieve 2% in 10 years, that's 20%. So yeah. But of course, they're not at that. So it could be 30, 40% or more.
Right. So let's move on to Stuart. Stuart says, what was your biggest challenge when starting out in real estate, and how did you overcome it?
It always is the same thing. Like, most people think it's money. Actually, I will tell you that. That's what's on most people's minds. That's the obstacle they use when they can't move forward. And I always mess around with people because I'm like, I'll give you the money. And then, of course, that obstacle, they don't have that obstacle anymore. Then it throws them off, right? Because that's something they can hide behind. It's not that. It's the actual deal itself. So when you start to look at a deal, there's math to it, right? So what's the math? What's the cash flow in it, et cetera? That's the hardest part. And I was talking to a guy yesterday. He's super frustrated because he's underwriting deals a lot, and he hasn't been able to find. He's writing offers, and he can't find anything. So it's always, with real estate investing, it's always the deal itself, and you got to be very, very careful. We look at hundreds and hundreds of deals every year, and we don't buy that many of them. So it's that.
Yeah, when you have a good deal, it's easy to raise money, right? I mean, how many people, if you came to me with Sydney's situation, I can cash flow $900 a month if I rent this thing out. Who's going to say no to that? Like, I'm not going to say no. You come to me with a cash flowing deal that really works once I look into it, I'm 100% going to do that. So, and you're going to have confidence in telling me. You don't have to sell me on it. You just have to show me the math. And so, yeah, to Ken's point, it's super easy to find people that'll give you money. It's just really hard to find a deal right now that cash flows.
Yeah. And the other part of the question was, how do you overcome it? You got to underwrite deals. You got to do the work. You got to do the math, and you have to make it part of your process. It's not going to be one day it's not like buying a shirt. Like, you have to commit to the process.
Absolutely. So our next question comes from Connor. So he sees that you have a jet, probably from Instagram. So he said, what should be considered before purchasing the jet? Like, what did you consider?
Yeah. So, a couple things. What the reason Ross, my partner, and I were actually very against having one, to be honest. We would always say, like, well, we could fly Southwest for a few hundred dollars. Why wouldn't we just do that? What happens is the jet itself has what's called bonus depreciation, and you can actually write off 100% of the jet, or you used to be able to. The laws changed. You used to be able to write off 100% of the jet in the first year, even if it's financed. So we were exiting some real estate, and as you should be doing this, before you sell something, you should be meeting with your tax people. And we were, and so this was part of our strategy. And so that was the first thing. We were trying to offset legally tax with this bonus depreciation, which you can get through the jet. So the jet falls in a category like the same as like farm equipment, oddly enough. And so that's number one. But number two, that we quickly realized that the operating cost for the jet, of course, is also expensive. So you want to make sure that you have steady streams of cash flow from lots of different things. So we have the development company, the construction company, we have the management company, we have KenCom, we have a bunch of different businesses that all contribute to the operating cost of the jet. And so I use it for all those different businesses. I'm going to use it to fly to Limitless as an example. We use it to go fly and look at deals to meet with lenders, or we go and fly deals just to look at new stuff. So so we do use it significantly for business. We use a little bit of it for personal, but it's usually primarily used for business.
I'm going to call you out on one thing.
Okay.
I've never seen you fly Southwest in my life. You like your assigned seats.
I do, but I definitely
You meant American. You like to fly American.
I do. I like both.
All right. We'll see you guys next week.
All right. See ya.